Last year I composed a double concerto for cello and violin. To help me think about the challenges of this form, I studied the Brahms Double Concerto for the same combination to see how he treated the soloists, what role they had in relation to the orchestra and to each other. In our last lesson, we looked at some of the ways a soloist can interact with the orchestra in a concerto for one soloist, Beethoven's Fourth. A double concerto, of course, does many of the same things, but there's also the issue of how the soloists relate to each other. That is the main subject of this lesson. Let's look at the Brahms. One obvious question in a double concerto is how the soloists arrive for the first time. As we can see in this example, the orchestra presents the main thematic material, tutti, and then the cello solo arrives after a little build-up at the end of the first system. It begins with the same three notes that we just heard in the orchestra, but slower and in the low register. Then it rises and develops the main theme for a while, still alone. Finally, it stops on a half cadence, which then overlaps into the return of the orchestra. But what about the violin? Having the violin just reply with the same material after that long cello solo might make it sound like a secondary instrument. So Brahms first briefly presents a new theme in the winds, and then the violin follows with its own little presentation of this new theme. And then, to show that this really is a double concerto, the cello enters with the same material and the two instruments engage in imitative dialogue. Note that they're still playing alone, no orchestra. Then both solo instruments speed up into quicker arpeggios. They eventually come together, playing in octaves, rising to a climax, whereupon the orchestra resumes the main theme. This is a very appropriate moment for such a prominent change. By now, the two soloists are firmly established in the listener's mind, so the orchestra continues with a full exposition on the same material. This is normal in the classical concerto form. After this elaborate orchestral exposition, the soloists will start to emerge in other contexts as the movement goes on. Up to this point, they have never been heard together with the orchestra. When the cello returns, it's playing a more lyrical version of the first theme, and for the first time, the orchestra, strings only, acts as accompaniment. After a few bars, the violin replies with the same cantabile version of the main theme in a higher register. The orchestra continues to accompany. What does the cello do now? It provides a little counterpoint. Very soon the two soloists settle down into arpeggios. Note how these arpeggios are personalized with passing tones and appoggiaturas, so as not just to sound like stock etude figuration. This is followed by faster figuration and alternation between violin and cello. The orchestra is still just accompaniment, now winds are added to the previous strings. Finally, the two soloists merge, playing the same rhythm at the same time, although in contrary motion. A new little section follows, wherein violin and cello continue to discuss the material in triplets. Then they merge again, playing arpeggios in the same rhythm. Here a new relationship emerges. Now the winds have the main thematic material, with pizzicato strings in the background, and it's the soloists who act as accompaniment, adding movement. Now Brahms shows us yet another kind of interaction. Here the cello plays the second theme while the orchestra amplifies the gesture. Winds alternate with pizzicato strings. The cello then plays a more expansive melodic line. When it comes to a rather inconclusive punctuation, the violin does the same thing with the same material. But the cello, instead of retiring, adds a more active line in eighth notes, then in eighth note triplets. So a texture which previously had 2 layers now has 3. Next, the violin and the cello appear in imitation. Note how the orchestra doubles only the main notes of the cello line, but not all of them. This is heterophony, with the cello being more active than the orchestra. Another interesting texture occurs shortly after. In the last 2 bars here, the violin has the top line first in double stops, then repeated with bariolage. Meanwhile, the cello doubles the orchestral bass line, but livens it with octave leaps. In addition to the bass line, the orchestra also includes offbeat chords in the horns, adding some rhythmic tension. In the next system, note how the soloists play the syncopated theme together, and then, while they trill, the woodwinds present the same idea. Yet another fascinating texture occurs here, as the soloists add nervous energy to the orchestra's material with trills in imitation. Our last example in this movement will be a very dramatic moment. Here the soloist had built up to a climax. Right before the orchestra begins the recapitulation, it confronts the soloist with tutti chords. The soloists answer with loud accented chords of their own. These chords culminate in a dominant seventh chord. Now when the main theme comes in, there's a sense that the orchestra has battled the soloists and won. Since it's such a salient moment in the piece, the interaction between soloists and ensemble is at its most intense. Note that this is similar to the passage we discussed earlier in the exposition, but that this time the orchestra is already present, so the sense of confrontation is even stronger. Now one last example from the second movement. This movement starts off with violin and cello doubling the main theme in octaves, along with the strings and the orchestra. In the seventh bar, the winds take over from the orchestral strings. What's interesting is the fact that the doubling is not literal. Every second bar has the orchestra becoming independent of the soloists. In the following bar, they go back into doubling. All through this concerto, we can see Brahms systematically exploring the many possible interactions between the soloists, and between the soloists and the orchestra. No one kind of interaction stays constant for long. This gives the music a dynamic energy that would not be possible in any other way. As in the Beethoven piano concerto we discussed last time, it's clear that the composer thought deeply about the concerto form. This piece is the masterful result.